the story is that DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency, was founded right after Sputnik in the panic that the Soviets were getting ahead of us in the space race, and so they created an agency in the Department of Defense which was supposed to look over the horizon. All the procurement was the Army, Navy, Air Force looking for a slightly better weapon system. DARPA was told, think 20 years out, work on technologies that'll make us superior over a long term. So what happened at DARPA was they created a small, very flexible agency where they brought in program officers who were top scientists and engineers. And those people working at DARPA really seeded the computer industry, that they saw that computerization was the wave of the future, but that we lacked all kinds of resources. So they funded the creation of computer science departments at major universities. They funded specific research on the human-machine interface to make the interaction with the computer more usable. And they did this all on a highly decentralized basis. Small offices, flexible program officers, not much paperwork. And it worked dramatically, that they drove a lot of the key advances that essentially got translated into the personal computer. The story is that that DARPA funded this research at the Xerox PARC labs, and at a certain point, Steve Jobs and Bill Gates came in and got a tour of what had been developed at Xerox PARC with federal money, and it was things like the graphical user interface, the Windows basic interface, the mouse, the Ethernet, many of these key technologies. And essentially what happened was that Jobs and Gates took those technologies and drove the rise of the personal computer industry. So this was history in the early 80s. The personal computer had already taken off. Policymakers understood that DARPA had done something very effective. The other piece of the story was that the internet began as the DARPANet. They had created these computer science departments at different universities. They said, let's connect them, and that was the first instance of the internet. They set up the basic protocols which operate to control the flow of knowledge, information across the internet to this day. The policymakers in the Reagan years said, let's build on this DARPA model. Again, not with the heavy hand, the centralized nature of the Japanese system, but something much more decentralized. And so the argument is that over the next 25 to 30 years, this kind of technology of innovation policy that DARPA pioneered began to spread across the federal bureaucracy. And so both defense agencies and civilian agencies learned how to do these kinds of policies. So, for example, at the Department of Energy, since, going back into the 1980s, they've been working to locate key technological barriers around energy. So one of the classic instances was that they realized that the turbines that were burning natural gas for electricity generation were working at a very low level of efficiency and producing a lot of pollutants that were going off into the air. So they said, if we could burn that natural gas at something like 2,000 degrees, there would be very little left to go into the atmosphere, and the efficiency, we would get much more bang for each quantity of natural gas that we're burning. So they set a project. They worked for about a year to set up the parameters. They worked with GE and Westinghouse on a cost-sharing basis. The feds put in 50 cents for each dollar, and the corporations put in the other 50 cents. They followed the DARPA model in that one of the pieces of the program was they created a turbine science program at a university. There had never been turbine science before, but it was a field at the confluence of a bunch of different scientific specialties. And it took 5 or 6 years, maybe 7, 8 years, but they, at the end, they got gas turbines which could burn at 2,000 degrees. The issue was, how did you keep the actual physical turbine, the wing of the thing, from melting at 2,000 degrees? And they solved that problem by putting irrigation systems in to keep the metal cooler while the fires were raging. The story is that Congress appropriates the funds for these programs to advance innovation policy, but there's a kind of collusion between the two parties to not make it a big public issue. For the Republicans, it's clear-cut because they've been, arguing that government is the problem, not the solution. So the idea that the government is actually playing a big role in driving innovation in the economy is inconsistent with their ideology. The Democrats' reason is to kind of keep the programs from becoming targets. If they kind of announce loudly that the government is doing a great deal, then the right will target these programs. So during the Clinton years, Clinton tried to expand some of these programs, make them a little bit more visible, and they became targets of the right. And when Gingrich came in 1994, Republicans took over Congress, some of these programs were cut back. A part of it is also journalism. I mean, that there's a kind of convention in journalism that when there's a big new innovation that some private firm has developed, they'll put maybe in the last paragraph of the story, and this research was funded by DARPA or the Department of Energy or whatever, but that they almost never kind of put that up at the beginning of the story and saying government industry partnership has produced a new innovation. We're beginning to see a little bit of change. The Obama administration has made a shift in that they've begun to announce the government's centrality to the innovation economy. They used a lot of the stimulus money to push innovation in clean energy technologies, and they expanded the role of government even from what it was before. Up until the Obama administration, the weakness in the government's policy was in the commercialization stage. I mean, that they were really good at helping firms get technologies from the lab to the point where they could be turned into actual products. But they didn't provide help to firms in moving to mass production. So with a whole series of technologies, other countries took the lead. So for example, flat panel displays were pioneered in the US, the basic technology for creating these things. We did first, but when it came time for mass production, that moved to Japan and Korea and Taiwan, in part because those governments were willing to help firms solve the problems in mass production. So the Obama administration saw that, and they said very clearly that it would be ridiculous to shift our cars from Middle Eastern oil to electric batteries that were made in Japan, Taiwan, and Korea. If we're going to do this, let's make those electric batteries here. So what they did is that they used a significant amount of money from the stimulus in loan guarantees to actually help private firms fund factories to produce those first generations of advanced batteries for the electric cars that are now coming off the production line. it is way too early to tell, but they very strongly twisted the arm of the Detroit auto companies in response to again the bailout and the use of stimulus money to prioritize the electric cars, to kind of reverse the sorry history of so the Chevrolet Volt is the first big success story. I mean, it came off the assembly line. It was won prizes as Car of the Year. Appears to be popular with consumers. So we're at the very early stages of this project of electrifying the automotive fleet, but we've gone a lot farther in the last 2.5 years than anybody would have predicted, which includes putting a lot of recharging stations online and so forth. So everything hinges on politics and what happens with the fight over the budget, what happens in the next election cycle. These gains could easily be reversed. The government role can't stop. The electric cars are being marketed with a pretty large tax rebate that's critical to get consumers over to deal with the higher costs. The idea is, of course, that as production on these things ramp up, they will be able to lower the costs and make them directly competitive with old-style cars without the tax incentive. But that requires a lot of experience with mass production. It requires scaling up. So that's why the tax credits are in there.